Hello, welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 5 of SQL Server. In this session, we'll understand what is cascading referential integrity constraint is all about. Now, to understand this session properly, I strongly recommend watching parts 3 and 4. In part 3, we have seen how to create tables and add primary and foreign key constraints. And in part 4, we have seen how to add a default constraint. If you remember, we have been working with tables TBL person and TBL gender in parts 3 and 4. And we have marked this gender ID column as a foreign key column within this TBL person table. So if I ask you what is the gender of Jade, what will you do? You'll check the value of this gender ID column, go to TBL gender table, check okay, number 2 is female, so Jade's gender is female. Now let's imagine what's going to happen if I delete this female record from TBL gender table. Obviously, Jade and May records will have no meaning. So if I ask you what is Jade's and May gender, number 2, we don't have a corresponding record here, so we will not be able to tell their gender. So these two records, Jade and May, will become orphan records. That's why by default SQL Server doesn't allow these kinds of deletes. Okay, let's flip back to SQL Server Management Studio, and if you look at the sample data that we have within these two tables, now if you look at Simon, the gender of Simon is 2, which is female. Now let's imagine what's going to happen if I delete this female record from TBL gender table. Mind you, in TBL person, there are still rows referring that value. So obviously, when I try to delete, I get an error. Okay, look at this. The error says there is, the delete statement conflicted with the reference constraint TBL person gender FK. Okay, so what is this TBL person gender FK? If you remember, in part 3 of this video series, we have created a foreign key constraint with this name, TBL person gender FK. So what is this constraint saying? This constraint is basically saying, so if we expand this tables and column specifications, so in TBL person, the gender ID column is referring to ID column in TBL gender. So that's what we have said using this foreign key constraint. Okay, now if you scroll down a little bit in this foreign key relationships window, there is this insert and update specification. And by default, if you look at the delete and update rule, it is set to no action. So the default is no action. So if it is set to no action, and when you try to delete any of the existing rows, for which there are references in TBL person, obviously if we allow that row to be deleted, these rows will become orphan records, and that kind of a delete will not be allowed by default. Okay, which is no action. So if you remember, for specifying the cascading referential integrity, you have 4 options. The default is no action, in which case you get an error and the statement will be rolled back. Okay, but you can also specify cascade, set null, and set default. First, let's look at set default. Now if you remember, in the previous session we have seen how to set a default using a default constraint. So if you look at the constraint that we have already on TBL person table, so it's called default on TBL person on gender ID column, and we specified that if somebody doesn't supply a value for the gender ID column, then we want to use a default of 3. That's what this default constraint does. And if you're not sure how to set up a default constraint, I strongly recommend watching the previous session in this video series. Okay, now what you can basically do is, in this foreign key constraint window, in insert and update specification section, let's say if somebody tries to delete a row, I want to set it to a default. Click OK, save the changes. Now if somebody tries to delete, okay, we already have a female record I mean, we have this female record here. If somebody tries to delete this female record from TBL gender table, we said any dependent rows, set it to default. And the default that we have here is it's going to set that to 3. Okay, so now let's try to delete this and see what's going to happen. And we select the data back, you should see Simon gender ID set to default, which is 3. Okay, and along the same lines you have other options as well. You can either cascade the delete and update operation, or you can set to null. Okay, let's see how set null works. So obviously, if you want to change the update and delete cascade operation, so you come to the insert and update specification. In the delete rule, let us say I want to set null instead of set default. Close and save it. Now let's go back to the tables. So in TBL person table, if you look at this, there are, let's say, John and Rich. Their gender is male. Now let us say I want to delete this male record. So what did we specify in cascading referential integrity? We said, use set null. Okay, so when I delete this male record from this table, from the primary key table, what's going to happen for the dependent rows? The gender ID for the dependent rows will be set to null. So in this case, John and Rich rows will be set to null. So let's execute that. Now let's select the data back. So John and Rich gender ID is set to null. Okay, and the final option that we have is cascade. Okay, as the name suggests, we want to cascade the update and delete operation to the dependent table. Okay, so how do we do that? Go into the foreign key constraint window. In insert and update specification section, instead of set null, we will say cascade. Close that, save. Now if you look at in TBL gender, we have number 3 unknown, and there are 3 people, Simon, Sarah and Johnny, whose gender ID is unknown. Now if I go ahead and delete this record from TBL gender table, all the dependent rows will also be deleted from TBL person table. So in this case, these 3 rows will be deleted. Okay, so gone all, those 3 rows are gone now. Okay, so basically, there are 4 options available for you when setting up cascading referential integrity constraint. The default is no action. If you set this option, by default you get an error and the update and delete statements will be rolled back. Otherwise, you can cascade the updates and deletes, or you can set null. The dependent rows can be set to null, or they can be set to defaults. Here you can find resources for ASP.NET and C# interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.